Hi, my name is Christiane Schmidt, and I'll be talking about how to achieve CDOs for all aircraft, automated separation in TMAs, enabling flexible entry times and accounting for wake turbulence categories, which is joint work together with Tatjana and Valentin Polishchuk, also as Javier Prats, Henrik Hardell, and Lucy Smetanova. So what's the background to our work? Well, we all know that air traffic volumes have increased over the last decades, and despite the current COVID situation, it is expected to grow again in the future. And while that comes with many benefits, it also comes with a high environmental impact and dramatically increased complexity for controllers. And those appear particularly in TMAs because there all the traffic converges. So what our overall goal is, it's to optimize arrival and departure procedures to alleviate both environmental impact and controller workload. And to alleviate the environmental impact, continuous descent operation are identified as a promising solution, for example, by Eurocontrol. So let's look at those CDOs in detail. The CDOs are optimized to the aircraft's operating capability, which means if we have aircraft with different characteristics, we also have different optimized trajectories. On the other hand, the STARs, so the strategically published arrival routes, they are done without taking the operating capability of each aircraft into account, so they severely limit the option of actually performing the optimum descent trajectories. Also, if we have different optimum trajectories, that reduces the vertical and temporal predictability of the incoming traffic, which directly increases the controller workload, and that means the controller will react by increasing separation buffers, for example, by using altitude assignments, speed adjustments, path stretching. And all of these will result in losses in airspace and runway capacity, which we, of course, do not want in highly congested TMAs. Also, the technique the controller applies degrade the performance of the descent operation, so we lose several of those nice environmental benefits that CDO entail. Also, the crew does not know the duration of the open loop vector instruction and when the aircraft will rejoin the initial route. That means that the FMS cannot predict the remaining distance to go and also not optimize the trajectory. So all these together result in that in today's busy TMAs, CDOs are hardly used. And we think one important point there to circumnavigate that is to support controllers in the separation task using automation tools. So how have we done so far to go to that way? Well, in work prior to what I'm telling you today, we presented an optimization framework for aircraft arrival routes, where we guarantee temporal separation. So any pair of consecutive aircraft was temporarily separated, but we used a uniform value, so always the same temporal separation. We used realistic CDO speed profiles, and we assumed that the arrival time to the TMA entry point is fixed for each aircraft. When we applied this framework to Stockholm TMA with an average traffic intensity scenario, we could accommodate only about 78% of the flights with CDOs. So why is that? It's not because of some computational limit of our optimization framework or the solvers that we use, it's because of the input. Aircraft arrive to the TMA entry points with less temporal separation than those 2 minutes. So that directly makes the problem infeasible, and we had to filter them out. Of course, what we could have done is to allow non-optimal speed profiles, and then we also would lose several of those nice CDO benefits. So we'll suggest to do something else today. We assume that the speed profiles along the en route segments can be adapted. So the aircraft arrival time falls in a time window, and within this time window, we can pick a time. That is, our profiles give both an RTA at the TMA entry point and a route length in the TMA. And when we use that, we could achieve a high throughput. So when we apply this to Stockholm TMA to one of the busiest hours of operation in 2018, we could enable all aircraft to fly CDOs. And we present another improvement. We let the separation be determined by the category of the leading and the trailing aircraft. And of course, that may change over time. We have merging traffic, so what was before the leading aircraft will change over time for any aircraft. Okay, so let's look at the concept of operation that we suggest to support the framework that we present. We assume that aircraft arrive to an extended TMA, and then they follow published routes to those yellow TMA entry points. In that time, they are still in the en route phase, and the FMS will compute the earliest and latest possible time of arrival at those yellow TMA entry points. And that depends, for example, on the aircraft performance and so on. And then we don't have any stars published, but we have a finite set of possible routes from these entry points. And the controller will request from each aircraft one profile per route length and per discrete values of RTAs in this interval between earliest and latest possible arrival time at the TMA entry point. When the controller receives them, the automated ground system will compute an optimal arrival tree and assign RTAs. So we have one arrival route per entry point to the metering fix. All aircraft follow the same route from that. And it's optimized for a specific time interval, so it will change during the day. It also means that we assign a new type of descent. So what we want is that when the aircraft arrive at the TMA entry point, they know the RTA and they know the arrival tree. This is computationally expensive, so it could also mean that we want to establish the communication between the aircraft and the controller well before the extended TMA to allow for those computations. So let's look at the components of our actual framework. We have two main components. One is the computation of CDO speed profiles for different lengths of the entry point runway paths for all aircraft that arrive in the considered time interval. And the second is a computation of the arrival trees that allow for temporal separation. All aircraft fly along the arrival paths, all use CDO speed profiles, and our temporal separation depends on the category of the leading and trailing aircraft. To compute these arrival trees, we use mixed integer programming. And in particular, we use a discretization. We overlay our TMA with a square grid. And then each vertex has directed edges to its 8 neighbors, like the pink one on the right-hand side. And these directed edges are the building blocks of our arrival trees. What that means is that we have a discrete set of possible entry point runway path lengths. So for each possible discrete path length and each aircraft, we compute a CDO speed profile. So we'll compute one, and then this is the input to our MIP. And this is the optimization of the vertical profile for a given route length. So let's look at the grid-based MIP formulation. In the previous MIP model, we had computed arrival trees, aircraft following specific speed profiles. We guaranteed temporal separation of a uniform value. We assumed that the arrival time to entry points is fixed, and we had several operational requirements. We said that no more than 2 routes may merge at any point, because merging could create a point of complexity, and having more routes merge increases it. And then for all practical purposes, we don't want to have them arbitrarily close to each other. That would still mean an area of high complexity, so we want to have them separated. Aircraft dynamics mean that we cannot have arbitrarily sharp terms, so we have an angle threshold and combine that with a minimum edge length, because otherwise, even if you have large angles, you can on a small area make a sharp turn, which again would be practically infeasible. We are able to avoid obstacles like no-fly zones, and we make a smooth transition between consecutive trees of consecutive time periods so they don't differ too much. And today we add the flexibility of times of arrival at the TMA entry points and the separation criteria based on the wake turbulence categories. So one variable that's kind of important, which we'll use to encode everything, and I thought to introduce it to it, it's a binary variable, YAJPNT. It indicates whether aircraft A, using speed profile P, occupies the nth vertex on the path from its endpoint, J at time T. But I'm not going to go into more math. So one new constraint is a flexible time of arrival at the TMA. So instead of requiring that aircraft A arrives at entry point B at fixed time TBA, it now arrives within an interval, and we add those constraints to enforce that it arrives exactly once, it doesn't arrive at any other time, and we pick one profile. And then the other new constraint is a separation with different weight turbulence categories. So before, as I said, we had this uniform value, all consecutive aircraft pairs were separated by sigma. Now we want to take the ICAO's aircraft categories, light, medium, heavy, and we could also use super into account. Sigma AB is now the temporal separation if the leading aircraft belongs to category A and the trailing aircraft belongs to category B. And what we'll do is we'll define C1 as heavy and medium and C2 as light. And then we introduce two classes of constraints, one if those two aircraft are of different categories and one if they are of the same category. Okay, let's look at the generation of CDO profiles. So we compute descent trajectories for each arriving aircraft, each possible route length within the TMA, and we assume usual CDOs for all descents, so either thrust and no speed brakes. Our route lengths give a fixed distance to go, so we can formulate the optimization of the vertical profile as an optimal control problem. And we assume a few things. We assume no wind and international standard atmospheric conditions. And we integrate the aircraft model, the current altitude, the true airspeed at the top of descent, and the distance to go. So let's look at two examples for that. Here we have for distance to go 36, 66, and 102 nautical miles, Airbus A320, a medium aircraft, and an Embraer EMB Phenom 100, a light aircraft. What we can observe is that if we look at the same distance to go, the light aircraft has a lower airspeed than the medium aircraft, which means it will take longer for the light aircraft to fly each segment in the TMA. Okay, and with that, let's look at the experimental study. We consider again Stockholm TMA. We look at one of the busiest hours of operation in 2018, May 16 from 5 to 6 a.m. We use historical flight trajectories from Open Sky and aircraft performance parameters from Beta 4.1. And if our aircraft model is not in Beta, then we use a comparable aircraft with respect to performance and dimensions. We solve our MIP with Garobi. We split the hour that we consider in 2 times 30 minutes. Why? Well, because of two aircraft, we needed to stretch a path. And when they then at some point already arrived at the runway and we still use a stretched path, this is no longer optimal. So we need to compute a new tree regularly, somehow in the order of the lengths that the aircraft spend in the TMA. And then we use those constraints that enforce consistency so that the trees do not differ too much. And we use an 11 by 15 grid, so we have a merge point separation of about 6 nautical miles. We use ICAO's separation minima. So if the leading aircraft is heavy, medium, and the trailing is light, then we have 3 minutes, and in all other combination 2 minutes. We schedule all aircraft to arrive within plus minus 5 minutes of the planned arrival time, the original arrival time. So we have a time window of 10 minutes. The given flights in our 11 by 15 grids have path lengths of 30 nautical miles to 108 nautical miles. So those are 14 discrete possible path lengths, and we compute 14 trajectories per aircraft, all with the same time at the TMA entry point. In the first experiment, we just use this original traffic. So at the left, you can see the resulting trees. The white is for the first half hour, and the yellow are the changes to those routes from entry point 1 and 2 to that tree. And on the right-hand side, you can see for all aircraft the timing when it goes at the entry points, at the different merge point, and at the runway. So we can schedule all of that. All the 30 aircraft, all fly CDO, it's feasible. And what we get is an average entry time deviation of 2.27 minutes. So from this original plan time. And let's look a bit at how that moves. So we have here the different merge points and the bottom, the runway, where you can see with which intervals they arrive. And the average time separation at the runway are 2.14 minutes. We look at a different experiment where we change the fleet mix and increase the number of light aircraft. So this is more proof of concept to see how different aircraft categories influence our trees. For that, we artificially increase the share of light aircraft to 20%. And that's far off from what we can observe in reality. So what we did is we just randomly chose 6 aircraft and substituted them by a light aircraft. Again, remember, they usually have slower speed profiles for arrivals. So what that meant here is that we could only accommodate 25 of the 30 aircraft. The trees are actually the same. And here we have the timing. So now the average entry time deviation is lower, 2.03 minutes, but simply because we have fewer aircraft that we schedule. And again, let's look at least only the runway, where you see that before every of those randomly integrated turquoise light aircraft, we have 3 minutes separation, at least at the runway. And we can also make sure that the optimization framework ensures that it will be overall, and we also check that. Okay, let's evaluate what we did. First, we'll look at some KPIs proposed by Eurocontrol EC. The first one is the minimum time to final. So the time to final is the time from an aircraft's current position to the final approach point. And the minimum time to final, we computed as a minimum time needed from any point within a grid cell to the final approach using any of the trajectories passing the cell. And what you have here from left to right are the original trajectories, the minimum time to final, the optimized trajectories, and the minimum time to final. And what we can observe is first that we have reduced lateral dispersion simply because all our aircraft follow the predefined routes. And we can also observe a significant reduction in the average time spent in TMA. It's 9.5 minutes versus 15.1 minutes for the actual trajectories. Second criteria is spacing deviation. A spacing for a pair of arriving aircraft is a difference in time to final. So the spacing deviation is defined for a pair of leading and trailing aircraft at time t. And this will give us information on the control error. So again, left is actual trajectories, right are the optimized ones. Here we cannot observe a significant reduction, but the idea is that the implementation will reduce the controller workload because they are no longer responsible for vectoring, but only have to monitor the progress of the aircraft along the predefined routes and do minor corrections in case of some problems. Finally, as one of those KPIs, let's look at the sequence pressure. So the sequence pressure for an aircraft at time t is the number of aircraft with the same time to final in a given time window. And we use 2 minutes. This reflects the aircraft density, and we calculated for each aircraft when it's present in the TMA in discrete time steps. And again, at the left, we have that for the actual trajectories, and at the right for the optimized ones. And here we can see a significant reduction in the sequence pressure for our optimized routes. Okay, finally, let's look also at the vertical efficiency and the distance flown in TMA. So here, actual routes in blue, optimized CDO-enabled routes in orange. We have altitude over distance to go in TMA. For the actual routes, we can see that they reach lower altitudes earlier, and they have long periods of level flight, and some at very low altitudes that will inadvertently lead to extra fuel burn and high levels of noise. And finally, let's look at distance in TMA, same color coding. One note here, that's an approximation because we use for each edge a length of 6 nautical miles, while the axis parallel edges are shorter than 6 nautical miles and the diagonal ones are longer than 6 nautical miles. If we use that, then we get a total distance covered in the TMA of 1,958 nautical miles for the actual routes and 1,578 nautical miles for the optimized CDO-enabled routes. And that's a reduction more, the difference is more than how we could underestimate. So we get an improvement. So let's look at conclusion and outlook. We showed that enabling flexible arrival times allows us to schedule all flights with CDOs. We guarantee temporal separation, which is based on the aircraft categories. This contributes to reduced environmental impact and an automated ground support for controllers. Our routes improve the vertical efficiency and the distance and average time in TMA. And we also proposed a concept of operation that can support our framework. For future work, we like to also evaluate the noise impact, the lateral efficiency. We like to look at a trade-off between robustness and uncertainty, and the influence of the time window when we shrink that or make it larger. How will that affect our ability to schedule? And with that, I say thank you so much for your attention, and I look forward to your questions.